Chapter 1, Part 3. Where are we coming from? What is important to realize is that the world of business has completely changed in a period of 15 or 20 years. You may, when you're in that period, it may not be so clear that actually the changes are so fast, but they pretty much are. And to illustrate that, I take an example from my own career. When I was 23 and had my master's, I joined Philips Electronics to do a PhD research there. And what did Philips Electronics look like back then? It was one of the biggest companies in Holland, some 300,000 employees, I think. And they were, in every branch that you could imagine. So that's September 1, 1987. What I intended to do there was to do some applied research. In fact, this was a corporate entity where I did that, so a central part of Philips. And I was in a group that had several people that did their PhDs within Philips. In fact, this department contributed considerably to the theory of supply chain management. The idea of the order decoupling point comes from that area. So there was a close connection between research and business there. But if you look at me and my career, well, I got a home from Philips. They had their own houses. This was in a street filled with other people that all worked for Philips. My house was filled, of course, with electronics electronics equipment from Philips, from the Philips store. Anything from the refrigerator to the CD player, it was all Philips made. And even the components in those machines were Philips made. And it was assembled in a Philips owned factory nearby. Of course, I did my sports activity in the sports facilities of Philips, and when I would have a lunch at Philips, it would be in the Philips-owned cafeteria. I didn't yet have to build a pension at the Philips Pension Fund, and of course I had my insurances with the Philips Insurance Fund at the IK. And all this was normal. But it's all gone. 20 years later, this was all gone. In fact, what was then the normal way in which a firm operated was soon seen as a plate of spaghetti, and it had to become a plate of asparagus. So, well, the first thing that happened was the unit that I worked in, the central unit, was split up, cut to pieces basically, and also the company was much more split into independently profit and loss responsible units, which they called unit management. This was called the unbundling of the firm. Those were popular terms of the time. All the non-core functions, so not just the cafeteria or some of the components equipment or some of the assembly functions, but also the IT, a lot of the advertising, design, you mentioned it. It was all outsourced. It was all not done by Philips employees, but by companies often populated with former Philips employees, but nevertheless companies that you had a contract with rather than people working for you. All the component and assembly was basically outsourced. Perhaps some critical functions were still there, but most of it wasn't, to contract manufacturers as they are often called, as suppliers. Even many of the consumer-facing activities like customer care or call centers were outsourced. A lot of the engineering was done by outsourced parties. And what left in the middle of the organization, you had many managers that were originally coordinating all these independent activities. And that layer was, well, it wasn't taken out. Now, still those people are there, but they work much harder because they still have their coordinating role. But this clay layer was very much diminished. The way that people treated each other also was much more formal. It was much more on objective, measurable criteria, often financial criteria, often more short-term criteria. And no longer on whether or not you were thought to be doing the right thing. in the 1980s, if you were listed on the stock market and you had a conglomerate of different activities, that was seen as a bonus by the financial analysts, because that meant that the likelihood that you would collapse was very low, because probably if it was going bad in one business activity, it would probably be going well in another. And that changes now, 10, 15 years later at least. This was no longer seen as an asset. In fact, it was a minus, if only because in the financial calculations there is a certain factor that you attach to the volatility or the risk of a certain sector, and if one company is in multiple sectors, how do you calculate then? And management became a generic skill. It no longer was thought the most important thing that you knew about the product that was being made there, knew about the service. No, it was much more an MBA type of manager was needed. There were certain generic skills that were required, and if you knew about the business, that was a bonus, and you would be transferred from one area to another. Many of the CEOs, for instance, from Philips after that time came from outside of the company. All this has been described in and theoretically based by many economic writers. One of the more popular ones is the article by Roberts, The Modern Firm. So that's what changed. And if you look at that in a picture, then you could say that this is the ideal world, the world that actually most people in Philips, but also all the other major electronics or major multinational companies at the time lived in. So there was an integrated, vertically integrated production process, from a component all the way to after sales and service on top of this, and that was all coordinated by centralized decision making. And even if you did the calculations, then the common saying would be that any optimization of those parts would be sub-optimization of the whole. But in retrospect, you could say that the changes that were there in theory weren't there in practice. In practice, this was too difficult. We didn't have the IT yet. There was geographical dispersion. So basically, all the different parts were run as individual parts and were doing their own sub-optimizations. So that wasn't ideal either. But what then happened is technological change and product life cycles that shrank. And so actually the speed of change in the environment increased, and now you had these super tankers of companies that couldn't adapt themselves quickly enough. A company like Philips was beaten all over the place by the Japanese electronics companies, who were much more nimbler, had far less investment in capital equipment like expensive machines or high-tech automation or MRP or what have you. But they were leaner, as the term has become to say, and also product life cycle shrank to a great degree. What you then have is what's called in the theory of cybernetic or system theory, Ashby's law of requisite variety, originally something from biology, where it said if you want to thrive an organism in a certain environment, you have to have as many possibilities to adjust your behavior as the environment requires. If you're in an environment that requires lots of variety, lots of different modes of behavior, you better have that. And some animals or some plants thrive in a very volatile environment, but don't do so well in a stable environment, and vice versa. The same is true for companies. So the business environment became much more volatile. And this is then an artist's impression, of what we have today. So we no longer have a one big supertanker. We have a whole flotilla of small and larger companies that still are not centrally coordinated, still do their own thing, and serve finally a group of final customers. And what you can see here is that the coordination challenge has only become much, much greater. So what we need now is no longer the big situation from the past that will not return for a long time. What we need is some way to coordinate all those different small ships and make sure that they move as one, or make sure that they at least move in the same direction quickly enough. Now, how that is to be done is still not a done deal yet, both in practice and in academia. We're not there yet. And the main part of this course is about how you deal with those issues of adjustment when no longer in practice or in theory you have integral control of all the different units that produce what you need to produce. I'll have some examples of those for you in a minute.